Shamanism 113. Shamans as storytellers. Oh, isn't this important? Storytelling is crucial to shamanism. It is the way that we've kept our wisdom intact throughout the millennia. Of course, it is the way that we share our wisdom from generation to generation. Storytelling is massive. It engages the listener. It engages the subconscious mind. Stories help us create healing modalities. Stories bring us into the imagination. Being a good storyteller is crucial to our work as effective and powerful shamans. Storytelling is not just for children, but you remember probably the most impactful stories from your childhood, and you remember as well, or even if you have kids, you know for sure that kids love to listen to the same stories on repeat, watch the same movies over and over again, because it does something to our minds when we can go back to these places and revisit them, and have a doorway into this imaginary realm where so much healing can happen. And it's not just children that listen to stories. Storytelling is a huge part of humanity. And it really is in some way what sets us apart from animals, because when we're telling stories, we're engaging the imagination, like I said, but we're forced to use language. Otherwise, our language could be quite, basic. Oh, just danger. Go that way. We could just use hand signals or guttural kind of like the purportedly the Cro-Magnons did. But we've developed our throat and our vocal cords and our voice to be able to tell stories. And when somebody's an amazing storyteller, isn't it just the most captivating thing ever? So I want to look a little bit about the history of storytelling, because, and if you look at this graph, you see those little zigzags, like that implies there's a lot more time. So you look at vocal only or verbal only storytelling was really, the largest part of our history. Because before we invented writing, stories were passed down orally. This was done by skilled storytellers who were able to memorize long narratives and perform them in front of their audience. And this tradition of oral storytelling is still going in many cultures around the world. And then writing, of course, came in about 3,500 BC. And in some ways, writing was able to overrule these oral histories, because there is something in our minds that says, if it's, black on white, it's a fact. Whereas we can often dismiss these wise old stories. What do we call them? Wives' tales or something like that, right? And, there's this idea, right? Like history is written down and her story has been told. For example, in the yoga world, we talk about Patanjali being, the creator of yoga, because he's the one who wrote the first book. But of course, yoga was around way before then. And as some of you know, yoga originated in Tantra, which is a women's tradition that was shared orally. So when writing came in, it was in ancient civilizations like Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then stories were able to be recorded and preserved. And this led to the development of epic poems and religious texts, which became important cultural artifacts. And then in the 15th century, we invented the printing press, which enabled us to mass produce stories and distribute them far and wide. And this led to the development of popular literature and the rise of literacy. And obviously, it would be neglectful of me not to mention that I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Bible is the most commonly published book. And then one of the most bought books a few years ago, at least, was The Girl Who Played with Fire. Do you remember that? It's a Swedish book, which is really interesting because it's very anti the patriarchy. And it's based on truth. And if you haven't checked it out, I really recommend that you do. But anyway, going back to the Bible. So obviously these sort of oral traditions means that the story can stay alive and we can modernize it into modern vernacular. updating the stories as we go to reflect the time that we're in. Whereas when we write something, it sort of gets frozen in time. So that's also an important thing, I think, to consider, that, when we read the Bible now, there's lots of things that don't make sense to us anymore. And, of course, like language also develops. So oral histories or oral storytelling keeps things alive and engaging in a way that, old printed material will sort of get dated. Then, of course, radio and television came in the 20th century, and that revolutionized storytelling, because we were then able to broadcast the verbal or the oral traditions, and of course also, with moving images, but also created entertainment and news media, which we might just call infotainment at this point. Anyway, now moving into the digital age, storytelling is much more accessible for everybody because we have access to the internet and social media. And then there's these new forms of storytelling like video games and virtual reality. But going back to the beginning, so cave art proves that we started telling stories as soon as our brains were able to. And through these stories, we developed abilities to communicate much more than other animals. At first, it was gestures and phonemes, and then those were used to form the foundation for more complex language. And this really took us an amazingly long time to develop, they say, over ages and ages. And now children are able to receive all this and learn it in a super high speed. Children learn to speak when they're very, very young. But this ability to speak about things that are not right in front of us has given us an incredible superpower. We have this extensive ability to communicate. Because, of course, communication is useful for survival. We can tell each other, exactly where those deadly saber-toothed tigers live, and so that we can make sure we stay away from them and live a long, happy life. But also using detailed communication, we can spread knowledge, we can share about advice and give advice, we can set rules for the tribe, and we can generate ideas. Communication has made us able to advance in ways that we couldn't before. But of course, we're not robots, so we're not always as accurate as we could be. Some of us are more tempted than others to add juicy extras to the facts. For example, you might exaggerate the size of the fish that you caught, or the fight that you had with that tiger, and describe yourself as the hero, although what really happened was that you were just watching the tiger from a safe place. Why do we lie? We lie because we want to make ourselves look better. We want to spice up the story, make it more interesting. But there's another benefit to lying. When we lie, it helps make the information stand out more and become more memorable. If we can make a better story out of something, we prefer often unconsciously to go for that, because the real version can be really boring and difficult to listen to or to keep in mind. So when we're telling stories, we understand that they're fiction and they're not true in the state of facts. But all the same, stories influence our perception of reality, and thus stories influence our human nature. And we can't help it. We love story patterns. We can even see story patterns and superimpose them when they're not really there. So there was a study done where people had to say what happened in a short film, and in the short film, all that they saw was these geometrical shapes randomly moving across the screen. And a whole bunch of people came up with their interpretation and tried to think of, what these shapes symbolized, and made it super deep and spiritual. And actually, it was only about 5 to 10% of the people who described what really happened on screen, that there was just a bunch of randomly moving shapes. I did an art piece in high school where I put this ladder to reach up to a rooftop, and around the ladder it said, you won't believe what's up there, and only the brave can see the truth, and all this stuff. And that wasn't the art. The art was people would go up there and there was nothing up on the roof, and they would come down and tell these elaborate stories of what they'd seen. And I wonder if that, if they were lying intentionally and making stuff up just to seem cool, or if I had somehow subliminally programmed them to see something special or experience something if it was me lying to them that made that happen, or whether it was a conscious choice to make stuff up to sound cooler. I don't know. So again, the evolution of storytelling from cave paintings to folklore to these big epics that were just, repeated all over, which then became these religious foundations, to carving them in, to handwriting them, to creating romantic stories about the elite, the kings and the queens, then becomes, plays that we can watch on stage, and then become the printing press, so that, we don't have to travel. We can invite the stories into our homes. And then, from there, journalism started to happen, where we could tell day-to-day stories. And then, of course, novels, and then films and more digital forms of storytelling. Storytelling is part of indigenous culture. It's a way to pass down knowledge and wisdom from one generation. When we tell these old stories, we are honoring our ancestors. Many of us shamanic people believe that our ancestors are still present and can offer guidance and support. So to honor our ancestors, we can speak their names, tell their stories, and ask for their wisdom and guidance. And I want to give you some reasons why storytelling is so important for us. Storytelling helps us connect with others. When we tell stories, we can build relationships. When we share our stories with others, we create this sense of community and belonging. Storytelling is also important for preserving our cultural heritage. They're a way to pass down knowledge and traditions and values from one generation to the next. And this is massively important, so that we don't move right into this globalized culture where we don't really feel rooted. Stories are also important for sharing experiences. We can share our emotions and help us, process difficult experiences and find meaning. And when we share, especially, difficult emotional events that have happened, other people can be inspired and find meaning and purpose for what they're going through. And so, of course, storytelling is a great way to develop empathy. When we hear stories, we can understand different people's perspectives and reasons for being the way that they are, showing up the way that they are, taking the action that they did. Stories, of course, are also massive in inspiring our creativity and our imagination. Stories can help us see the world in new ways and encourage us to think outside the box. And lastly, stories often have moral lessons in them. So stories can help us learn important life lessons and help us navigate the challenges in our lives. And as shamanic people who have been intentionally eradicated, our stories are especially important because they hold sacred wisdoms and sacred teachings that would be lost if we lose these stories. There is also this aspect of shamanic storytelling that helps us connect to the divine. When we tell stories, we can use our imagination to access the spiritual realms, where we can communicate with spirits, spirit guides, and ancestors. We can also use these stories to connect people, the listeners, to their own spiritual essence and to help them find more meaning and purpose. And storytelling, shamanic storytelling, is often a form of healing as well. When we tell stories, we can help those who listen to process difficult emotions, to find deeper meaning in their experiences and connect with their own inner wisdom. We can also use these stories to help individuals understand their personal journey and that they're not the only ones that have gone through this, and find a better direction. And as shamans, we are often seen as teachers, and so when we use stories, we can access that subliminal realm and have a powerful tool to help us convey important information and wisdom. We can teach about the natural world, the importance of balance and harmony, and the true interconnectedness of all things, of Watatanka or Great Spirit or the Almighty. Stories is also great because they entertain. Stories that entertain can provide that sense of connection and community. So as shamans, we are massively important as storytellers because we're able to, come out of these kind of more titillating, cheap stories and use stories to connect with spiritual realms, preserve our cultural heritage, facilitate healing, teach important lessons, and provide, I want to say, useful entertainment. These old shamanic stories are often considered to be sacred teachings that hold important knowledge and wisdom, and they play a vital role in many shamanic cultures around the world. So, of course, storytelling is an exchange of energy. There's a storyteller on one side and one or many listeners on the other. And the story contains the experiences, the opinions, the knowledge, and the moral values of the storyteller wrapped up in, an imaginative package. And this is vital for the survival of our species and for the thriving of our species. Instead of bringing new abilities to the next generation by long evolutionary processes, we can keep our species up to date by providing useful information through language. And when we do that in the form of stories, it makes it more fun. So what does this mean for you? Well, first of all, as a storyteller, and especially as a shamanic storyteller, be aware of your responsibility. The stories you tell contribute to our collective consciousness. And now, of course, the internet has made it easier than ever to share our ideas with millions. And maybe you want to just entertain people, but you can't get around it. You will have an influence as a shaman. And so to use your influence in a positive way to change and expand your viewers or readers or listeners' minds. As a storyteller, we have a privileged view. As a writer, as a speaker, as a dancer, as a shaman, we observe human behavior, gestures, reactions, and social structures and their emotions on a meta level. We are the ones that see the details and understand the interrelational structure of how and why things happen. It's important that we analyze and understand them almost like a psychologist, so that we can create characters, dialogues, and movements that are convincing. And this is something that, quote unquote, normal people don't do. So in order to be a great storyteller, you must be a great observer of detail and of humanity. Of course, stories are something artificial, but stories are a way for us to capture the essence of life, of human feelings, of problems. And as storytellers, we explore these every day. And luckily, of course, we're surrounded by other humans, so there's more than enough opportunity to study for authenticity and inspiration. As storytellers, we are shamans. There is no way of getting around that. There is magic, deep magic, in telling stories and inviting people into the imaginative realms, into the non-physical. Using your ideas, using your observations, and your fantastic art, you can create impressive moments that impress and entertain and invite magic. And as you do this, make sure to tell your tribe what they need to know. Share about life, society, feelings, problems, hopes, and dreams. This is what it's all about. Storytelling is not about making money. Storytelling is used to hold up a mirror, to make a point, to enlighten, to help, and to inspire. So use this to create something of value. Storytelling is a need. It's an instinct. It's always been there. It always will be as long as we exist. And of course, over the ages, we've perfected the art of storytelling. we've discovered sort of guidelines and rules that make stories more appealing and more interesting. The main reason, though, why we tell stories haven't changed. We use stories to get a point across in an appealing, memorable, and impressionate form. Storytelling is using your voice, whether your voice comes out of your mouth or your pencil, or into creating music, or using your voice in the way that you move your body, whatever it is, in the way that you paint. We're using our voice to tell a story that has a definitive meaning to help to uplift the human spirit. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.